Tonight on Newsnight Scotland, one of the world's leading climate change experts warns us we face disaster unless we begin cutting carbon emissions now. But since the onset of the financial crash, is anyone still listening? Good evening. The world-renowned American climate scientist James Hansen of NASA is in Scotland this week to pick up the Edinburgh Medal, a science award. Tonight he addressed an audience at the capital's International Science Festival. Few dispute his scientific expertise, but he has recently become a controversial figure by taking part in protests over climate change. He's even been arrested on several occasions.
No gas, no coal, no compromise.
Dr. James Hansen heads NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, but he's perhaps best known for bringing global warming to the world's attention in the 1980s when he first testified before the US Congress.
The greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now.
More than 30 years ago, Hansen and his team created one of the first global climate models and used it to predict much of what has happened to the climate since. His researchers, together with those of other scientists, have informed the calls for governments across the world to confront climate change. In 2009, he wrote to Scotland's First Minister asking for a moratorium on coal-fired power. Dr. Hansen claimed the Bush administration had tried to undermine his global warming claims. Recently, he's come under fire himself for behaving as an activist rather than sticking to his role as a scientist. He's won many international awards and accolades for his work in climate change and has been arrested 3 times at protests against coal mining and crude oil production. Well, earlier today I caught up with James Hansen. I put it to him that he thought the current projections about climate change are too conservative.
Well, what we've realized is that the level of global warming at which dangerous effects will come into being is lower than what we thought a few years ago. So targets to keep global warming less than 2 degrees Celsius are actually disaster scenarios, because the last time it was 2 degrees Celsius warmer was the Pliocene, when sea level was about 15 meters higher. And it was quite a different planet than the one we see now.
One of the things that struck me was your forecasts for what needs to be done in order to get CO2 back to 350 parts per million, and how more difficult that becomes if you delay doing anything about it for only a matter of a few decades. Just explain that.
Yeah, if we had started in 2005 to reduce our emissions, we could have reduced them 3% a year and stabilized climate this century. If we start now, it requires 6% per year emissions reductions. If we wait another 10 years, it becomes 15% per year, which is impractical. So we really need to start soon.
Now, you want 6% cuts in emissions starting now.
Yeah, starting next year.
The obvious problem is that despite incredible amounts of rhetoric by politicians and the Kyoto Summit and the Kyoto Treaty and all the rest of it, we aren't cutting emissions, and that it's just not going to happen next year.
Well, it's not going to happen as long as we continue to subsidize fossil fuels and do not put a price on them to make them pay their cost to society. If we would simply do that with a gradually rising price or tax or fee on fossil fuels, then we would begin to phase them out and move to clean energies.
But you're talking initially of, say, $15 per tonne of emitted CO2. Have you done any calculations of what that would mean in terms of, for example, people's electricity bills, or what it would do to a ticket to fly across the Atlantic?
What it would do, in the United States, the most relevant number is what does it do to the price of petrol at the station? Well, after 10 years, it would amount to $1 a gallon. But
how much is petrol in the United States at the moment?
It's about $4 a gallon now.
Okay.
But that would reduce our emissions by 30% at the end of 10 years, the economic models show. So that's much more effective than any of these cap and trade with offset schemes, which amount to nothing in the end.
The problem you have, though, is that in order for this to work, it's got to affect people. It's got to hurt.
Yes.
I mean, if you could take the comparison with the so-called Tobin tax on the idea of taxing financial transactions on a global scale, it's at a fractional rate. The argument is you'd raise billions of revenues, but no one would ever really notice. But that would defeat the purpose of people have to notice.
Precisely. It has to be a tax which is enough that it's going to affect people's choices. But if the money that is collected is distributed to the public on a per capita basis, so the person that does better than average in limiting their fossil fuel use will actually get more in their monthly dividend, then the public would allow it. But if the money is taken by politicians and they get to decide which lobbyists they will distribute the money to, then the public is not going to allow that. They will throw out anybody from office if they do that.
I come back to the point that it's sort of gone off the agenda. I mean, you presumably must be disappointed in the Obama administration, because unlike the previous administration, they made all the right noises, but nothing much has happened.
Yeah, precisely. It's politics as usual, and the effectiveness of the people who prefer to see business as usual continue, the effectiveness in keeping the public confused. But we will have to fix this soon, or our children and grandchildren will suffer the consequences. And Mother Nature is going to help, because the climate effects are becoming more apparent. What used to be a 3 sigma event, what we call a very unusual warm season, which occurred only a couple tenths of 1% of the time, is now occurring about 10% of the time. The person who is observant can see that the climate is beginning to change.
One of the points that you yourself make is that you have to calculate the effects of carbon emissions over the life cycle of carbon in the of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which I think I'm right in saying makes us in Britain have the proud distinction of being more responsible for global warming than anyone else, even though that was historical.
On a per capita basis, Great Britain is most responsible, the United States is next, and Germany is third, because it's the excess CO2 in the atmosphere today, not the current rates of emission, that are changing the climate. So we have a responsibility, and frankly, Britain is beginning to take some steps. I think that you are stopping the building of more coal-fired power plants. That's a major step in the right direction.
I wouldn't be quite as optimistic as you seem to be in that front, but there we are. There are one in England was cancelled. There are proposals to build coal-fired power plants in Scotland with carbon capture and storage. The only problem with that is we know how to do the coal plants, we don't know how to do the carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, that's right. If they really capture all or almost all of the CO2, then that might make sense, although I think that will make it so expensive that they won't do it. But to pretend, by saying, oh, we're going to capture 15 or 20%, that's a hoax. You have to capture it all, or else it doesn't make sense.
You would prefer a mix of renewables and new forms of nuclear energy, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think that we need, for baseload electric power, we need next generation nuclear power, which can be much safer and which can burn nuclear waste and solve that major problem with nuclear power.
What do you say to people, and there are a lot of people who criticize the fact that you've become something of an activist on this rather than just a scientist? I mean, you don't just write papers, you now get arrested outside the White House seemingly on a fairly regular basis. And some of you, I think some people who sympathize with your views are saying, look, you're selling the past, you're compromising your position as one of the world's leading scientists on climate change by, in effect, behaving like some kid at university who was out in a demonstration.
Well, I think the science has to stand on its own merits, and there are ways that the scientific community has of reviewing science. But, well, I think it's irresponsible if not to point out the consequences of the climate change. So I don't understand the objections. You know, I have children and grandchildren, and I think I have a responsibility to them. Not just to do the science, but to point out what is the consequence.
All right, we'll leave it there. Luke, Jim Hansen, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by the Scottish Green Party co-convener Patrick Harvie, and from Oxford by the environmental campaigner Chris Goodall. Well, look, first of all, Patrick Harvie, where we are, I mean, since Copenhagen failed rather spectacularly, has anything actually happened in this debate over climate change?
Well, the recession has happened, and what we've seen is governments which have been keen to say we take climate change seriously, we want to set targets, unfortunately sort of going along with the claim that the reductions in emissions we've seen as a result of the recession are achievements. I think there's a real danger that if and when we start to come out of recession properly, we'll start to see those emissions bounce back up again. And we'll find that the reductions that we've seen over the last few years have not been the result of policy, but have been the result of economic circumstance.
The issue has, to some extent, Chris Goodall, hasn't it, gone away in the public debate, in the public imagination?
Yes, indeed. One very rarely hears people talking about it. 5 years ago, it was very different. But as Jim Hansen said, the issue has pretty much disappeared.
The problem with that is it starts to look as if climate change, although I'm sure you think it shouldn't be seen in this way, is a sort of fair weather issue, if you'll excuse the pun. In other words, that when things are going relatively well with the economy, people are prepared to pay attention to it. But as soon as people have what they see as more pressing issues on their mind, it just goes out the window.
Well, we're lucky here in the sense that we're not actually seeing the impact of climate change yet. There are parts of the world, including, for example, the United States, where it's painfully apparent that temperatures are increasing, rainfall extremities are becoming more frequent. Now, in this country, we're pretty much shielded from this by our climatic background, but that doesn't mean to say the problem isn't serious and getting more serious every day.
Right. If that is the case, though, and if you agree with James Hansen that these 6% per annum, what he's suggesting is from 2013, the world needs to cut carbon emissions by 6% per annum in order to avoid catastrophic changes to the climate. I mean, it simply isn't going to happen, and there seems to be absolutely no momentum at the moment towards making anything like that happen.
No, I think actually things are going slightly better than we might think. It may be, as Patrick said, that a lot of the reductions in emissions that we're seeing are as a result of the recession around the world. But governments slowly, ponderously are getting to the point where they are taking action, and we are seeing real reductions in emission, and we are, for example, seeing more and more energy in this country produced by renewable sources.
Just as a matter of fact, I mean, what is happening to carbon emissions on a world scale now? They're not actually going down, are they?
No, they're certainly not. They are in this country. They're going down quite sharply in this country. In most of the developed world, in China, they continue to increase.
So to get from where we are now to James Hansen's proposal of 6% cuts would be an absolutely enormous task.
Yeah, but it's worth saying that James Hansen sits at one end of the spectrum of the scientific community. Other people, for example, the UK government's Committee on Climate Change, is giving figures more of the order of 3 or 4% per year. But in any event, this is going to be we need to substantially change direction, and to do so in a very short number of years.
And if we are to do that, Patrick Harvie, I mean, doesn't James Hansen have a point? You might not agree precisely with his idea for a carbon tax, but at least it's a specific proposal that everyone can focus on, whereas what we seem to have at the moment are a lot of diffuse different proposals, which probably have an effect at the margin, but not anything like the effect that he would argue, and presumably you would agree we need to have.
Well, there are things that can have a much more dramatic, certainly not a marginal effect in specific countries. You know, we've just had mention of renewables, and in Scotland, yes, we have this historic responsibility because of our contribution to climate change through emitting carbon dioxide, but we also have this profound opportunity, a real opportunity to produce a huge amount of renewable energy, not just for our own benefit, and hopefully for the public benefit rather than just shareholder value for a few big businesses, but also to export to fulfil need beyond Scotland itself. So there are opportunities to do dramatic change, to achieve dramatic change, which don't necessarily depend on those kind of global deals. I'll just come from a showing of The Island President, the film about the president of the Maldives, who, you know, after trying to push for democracy, becoming the president after being an activist in exile, and trying to give global leadership on climate change, because he knew that the generation growing up at the moment may be the last ones who have an island group to live on. You know, taking this message to the world stage and demanding dramatic action, but also demonstrating the responsibility as a small country to take dramatic action at home. You know, that's the kind of leadership that we really do require.
Okay,
it's not going to come from those who simply see this as an opportunity for a different kind of GDP growth.
Isn't the bottom line here, Chris Goodall, if you really want to do something in the short to medium term, there are two things you need to focus on. One is carbon capture and storage, not particularly because of here in Britain, because to develop the technology, because of the coal plants that have been built, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, and a new generation of safer nuclear power stations that don't emit carbon.
Yes, I'm afraid I think that absolutely is necessary. The government has sort of acknowledged both of those 2 points. I think one of the difficult things is that the environmental movement as a whole is not finding it easy to move to a position where it supports either of those two, but particularly nuclear power. But without nuclear power, I don't think any of the targets that James Hansen mentioned are achievable in the UK.
Yes, but again, I mean, that would take enormous cross-country government agreement to do a programme like this, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, there's absolutely no sign, partly because of, again, we're not talking about the climate change here, but because of things like Fukushima, there's absolutely no sign of that happening.
Well, there are people who want to build nuclear power stations in the UK. The French company EDF will probably build nuclear power stations in England over the next 10 years, but there isn't that much appetite for it, and we need to have 10 or 20 of these things for it to make a real difference to our electricity supply.
Do you think you as the Greens should think about, I mean, an increasing number of environmentalists are coming around to the idea that new generation nuclear power, which doesn't have, allegedly, a lot of the problems of the old generation, is a good idea, and that, you know, with respect to what you're saying about Scotland's opportunity for renewables, that's fine, but in terms of UK-based power load, you need something more than that, and that nuclear power is actually, as, well, Chris Goodall and James Hansen both agree, the way to go.
You come up against this problem, as you do on how to get emissions reduction globally and a political deal for that. This problem about necessity and possibility. You know, if the argument is that a new generation of clean, safe and sustainable nuclear power plants are necessary, I still ask, are they possible? You know, I'd love to see a blueprint for a genuinely clean, safe and sustainable nuclear technology, but I'm not convinced one exists yet. Now, you know, if in the future some radical new form of technology becomes available, I think a lot of people would look at it. But we look at what's possible now and we say it's not clean, not safe, not sustainable, and also not affordable. No, it requires a huge subsidy, and that's why some of the companies are pulling out at the moment, because they don't see that subsidy coming forward.
Well, so do renewables, of course. But
Absolutely.
Chris Goodall, what is your view on that? I mean, I know technically there are these new generation of power stations which are much safer. But as Patrick Harvie says, when it comes to, here's a proposal to build one commercially, the proposals are a bit thin in the ground.
No, there are several companies wanting to do it. Patrick is right that the German companies RWE on EM backed out a couple of weeks ago, saying that they couldn't raise the money to do this. Nuclear power stations are immensely expensive.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Very quick look at tomorrow's front pages, starting with the Herald, leads on curriculum for excellence, warning over delivery of new schools curriculum. It says fears reforms may never be achieved in full. The same story in the Scotsman, failure at the heart of Scottish school reform. Scathing report condemns tick box introduction of new curriculum. It says the Daily Mail, £200 on all fuel bills if we split from the UK. It says families cash blow over SNP's green targets. And in The Guardian, wave of panic selling rocks euro market. That's all we have time for tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Good night.